Today on the Daily Scoop podcast from the Scoop News Group, GSA's central role in the Trump administration. FedScoop reporter Miranda Nazzaro, who reports on the GSA, takes you inside. It's Tuesday, January 27th, 2026. Welcome to the Daily Scoop podcast, where you'll hear the latest news and trends facing government leaders. I'm the host of the Daily Scoop podcast, Billy Mitchell. Thanks so much for joining me. Now let's dive into the day's top headlines. The Treasury Department said Monday that it would cancel all of its contracts with Booz Allen Hamilton, linking the decision to a former employee now serving prison time for leaking tax returns. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said in a 3-paragraph press release that the agency's 31 contracts with Booz Allen worth $21 million in total obligations and $4.8 million in annual spending would be scrapped as part of President Donald Trump's push to root out waste, fraud, and abuse. Bessent said canceling these contracts is an essential step to increasing Americans' trust in government. Booz Allen failed to implement adequate safeguards to protect sensitive data, including the confidential taxpayer information it had access to through its contracts with the Internal Revenue Service. A Booz spokesperson said in an email to FedScoop that the firm was surprised by this announcement, especially given Treasury's reasoning regarding Charles Edward Littlejohn, who between 2018 and 2020 leaked the confidential tax returns and information of hundreds of thousands of taxpayers. That spokesperson went on to say that, quote, Booz Allen fully supported the U.S. government in its investigation, and the government expressed gratitude for our assistance, which led to Littlejohn's prosecution. We were surprised by this announcement and look forward to discussing this matter with Treasury, unquote. Per the Treasury release, the IRS determined that the data breach affected roughly 406,000 taxpayers. Littlejohn, who was sentenced to 5 years in prison last January after pleading guilty to one count of disclosing tax return information without authorization, leaked the returns of Trump, Elon Musk, and other wealthy individuals to a pair of news organizations. Now moving on to other news, NASA has a new top official for artificial intelligence and data. Kevin Murphy began serving in an acting capacity in both roles November 30th, 2025. NASA spokesperson Jennifer Duran confirmed to FedScoop in an email. He replaces David Salvignini, who was the agency's CDO for roughly 2.5 years and CAIO for just over a year and a half. Salvignini was the agency's first ever CAIO. According to Murphy's LinkedIn, he has been at NASA for over 17 years. He first served as a system architect at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center and has held a series of data-related roles, including Chief Science Data Officer. As the agency's lead for data science, Murphy has already worked to advance technologies such as cloud computing, machine learning, and data platforms for use with NASA's scientific data per an agency bio. He also oversees the agency's high-end computing capability, or HECC, portfolio, which deploys computing technologies to support large-scale modeling, simulation, and analysis at the agency. Murphy's designation as acting CAIO and CDO come after Salvignini announced his plans to leave the agency in a LinkedIn post roughly 2 months ago. In that post, Salvignini said he opted into the Trump administration's deferred resignation program and said he began his transition October 31st and would retire from federal service in the spring of 2026. For more news at the intersection of the federal government and technology, make sure to visit fedscoop.com. The General Services Administration has leaned into its role as a central shared services provider for the rest of the federal government during the second Trump administration. In particular, it has taken a leadership position centralizing most federal procurement under one roof and serving as a sort of clearinghouse for federal AI efforts, among others. With so much transformation underway, the GSA during Trump 2.0 has taken on an even brighter spotlight, fueling federal operations. Miranda Nazzaro is the FedScoop reporter covering GSA during this pivotal time, and she's joining me now to discuss some of the agency's top priorities, from OneGov and the TMF to eliminating woke AI. Let's now go to that conversation with FedScoop reporter Miranda Nazzaro. Miranda, good to see you. Welcome to the podcast. It's your first time, I believe. I don't think we've done this before.
I don't think so. Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah. Well, you've been on board with us. You're coming on close, in a couple months. It'll be your first year with us with FedScoop, and you've been covering GSA pretty religiously since coming on board and doing a tremendous job at it. And I want to kind of spend some time with you diving into that today, because as we've kind of come to the 1-year mark of the Trump 2.0 administration, we've really seen GSA sort of emerge as this leader in providing sort of central shared services, whether it be procurement or AI or different things. And I know you've been closely watching a lot of those different things. And one of the key things that the Trump administration has pushed is this notion of OneGov in the way that the federal government buys common services. And quite frequently, that's technology services under OneGov. So let's start there. I know you've been doing a lot of reporting on that program, quite frequently writing about the announcements when new software providers or technology companies reach agreements under that. So a year into that sort of program or initiative, how are things going for that under your purview?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, as you mentioned, GSA really sits at the heart of a lot of the biggest technology initiatives in the federal government. So the Trump administration, back in the beginning for the second term, basically tasked GSA specifically with streamlining procurement, really consolidating most technology procurement to that agency. So they've done this through the OneGov contracting vehicle, which basically aims to work directly with the original equipment manufacturers or just technology vendors instead of resellers. Now, that has been the vision in terms of how that's played out. Like any new program, there have definitely been some learning curves as several folks at GSA have said. So a lot of the deals that we saw rolled out at first with companies that already worked with the government. You have Microsoft, SAP, companies like Google, where they're already familiar in the government contracting space. So it was a lot easier to work directly with the OEMs in that case. However, you have some new players like OpenAI, Anthropic, mostly the AI companies in general, who are newer to this space. And as a result, you still have the reseller in the process. So I think 2025 for OneGov was about sort of laying this foundation. A lot of folks in December said that the next iteration of this is trying to work with more OEMs directly instead of through resellers. But unfortunately, just given how long the process takes for companies to, whether it's get FedRAMP approved or even just ATOs. So I think that's what they're looking for in 2026. You'll also notice that a lot of the deals that happened in the first place were with AI companies. For very small dollar amounts that agencies could get their technology. And now you're starting to see it not be as much about AI companies. You're seeing some cybersecurity companies. So it seems like they're also sort of shifting their focus a bit in terms of the companies they're looking to work with. Also, I'm not saying that doesn't mean AI companies aren't welcome. I think just they hit a lot of the major players within 3 to 4 weeks. So I think we're going to start to see some different types of vendors, like even Uber has a OneGov deal. So I think that's something to be on the lookout for.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I think, there's been this rush to get AI into government, and that's why you saw that happen in that way. And now you'll see some more of the commodity IT that, the services that federal workers use every day that maybe they don't think a lot about how the federal government buys it, but it seems like the strategy is looking to approach it where, agency A and agency B have the same terms and agreement so that the federal government's getting the best value for its large purchasing power. You mentioned the reseller aspect, and I know up front when I was doing some watching of this OneGov initiative that the reseller part was one thing that they wanted to get out of the way of. They saw it as a wasteful middleman, so to speak, or that it was just adding to the overall overhead costs. So tell me where things stand now. You mentioned that there was maybe a sort of looming shift in that direction or some sorting out that GSA and the Trump administration want to do. I know that you recently wrote about a new RFI that GSA put out. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I think an interesting caveat to all of this is that they have framed OneGov as wanting to sort of eliminate that middleman reseller. But in recent weeks and even some recent months, a lot of GSA leaders, I noticed this at an event I was at last month, really emphasize that they still want resellers to play some sort of role. There was the whole idea of flipping the role of the reseller and the OEM, but that's not necessarily what's happened, just given some of the other complications that come with working with the government. So this RFI that was put out last week was basically asking industry, including the resellers themselves, how can we improve cost reductions when it comes to value-added resellers? So these are resellers that are also kind of customizing a product when it comes to them before reselling it to the government. So this is just kind of getting more at the cost reduction component, streamlining it. And they're also, I think you can kind of read between the lines in the RFI and see that GSA is looking at ways to, how do we get the most bang for our buck, whether it's from a reseller or an OEM. So, I think, as you mentioned, there have still been a lot of deals with resellers, and I think there will continue to be. But I think they're trying to make sure that if we are still going to be working with resellers, we're getting the most we can out of it. And a lot of that RFI is looking at duplicative costs, markup costs, like how much is the reseller increasing the cost of the product versus, what they bought it for from a vendor like OpenAI or something like that.
Will certainly be interesting to watch how that sort of unfolds. We talked a little bit at the top of our conversation about how important AI has been, and GSA has really been sort of promoting that, not only through the procurement aspect that we just discussed, but also, as a service provider. It has sort of served as, for lack of a better term, a clearinghouse that brings together these AI tools, presents them to the federal government, and sort of lets agencies test them out, short of having to go out and acquire them on their own. So earlier, or I guess last year now, it wasn't earlier this year, it was last year, the middle of last year, FedScoop reported on a GSAI and USAI, and that being sort of that figurative head of that initiative. But there's also been some interesting developments lately around GSA providing AI and sort of also vetting whether some of that AI meshes well with the Trump administration's priorities, like eliminating wokeness and how some of those AI models might contain some of those biases. So what is GSA's role as it relates to that, and where are things today as that develops?
Right. So I think with the rollout of USAI that we saw in August, which is basically this evaluation tool that agencies can use to test out different AI products before deciding to procure it from the GSA schedule and or a OneGov deal. Their role there is they really just want to be the provider of the tools. A lot of questions have come up when it comes to different AI models, their hallucinations, their output. Grok from XAI has obviously been a big topic of that conversation. And Grok, isn't on USAI yet, does have a OneGov deal, but that's a good example of one where they are kind of being forced to answer these questions. And when you ask them, they say Grok is still undergoing safety testing. And then the other flip side of that is, as you mentioned, there's this really big push right now in the administration against so-called woke AI. When this executive order first came out in July, there was a lot of confusion as to what that actually means. I think there still is some confusion. OMB did release some guidance on it last month, but it actually wasn't directly calling out GSA, which I found kind of interesting, given how big of a role GSA plays in getting AI into agencies. It more so talked about the decisions that individual agencies should make. So I think GSA is kind of in this gray zone of they're helping provide the tools, but they're also not necessarily making decisions as to what DOT or FAA might choose when actually picking a model. I think it really does remain to be seen because at first a lot of people said this woke AI order, is this a messaging tactic? How do you even really test this? And I think it's going to take a while before we can see how either GSA or other agencies try to comply with this kind of vague order.
Yeah, it'll certainly be interesting to see, what end stance the administration takes, and then how AI companies sort of tailor their models to make sure that it plays nicely if it does get to that level of scrutiny. The last thing, GSA's done so much. One area we haven't touched on that has been in the news a lot recently is the Technology Modernization Fund, which is really a government-wide fund, but it's housed in GSA. And the struggles that fund has had, both in terms of getting reauthorized as that authorization expired at the end of last year, and the funding element, which has been a perennial issue. So where do things stand today in its authorization cycle, and also having the appropriate funding to do the modernization that it set out to do?
Yeah, so the TMF is currently on pause. It was not reauthorized in early December, which surprised a lot of people given it's a pretty bipartisan measure. It's usually just a procedural matter of one or two senators may be holding it up. And once it didn't get reauthorized, and as you know, Congress is constantly dealing with these spending packages and these battles and the inability to pass them on time. We saw just last week reauthorization for the TMF at least through the end of fiscal year 2026. So that's the end of this coming September. For it to be reauthorized is included in that spending package. Now, that spending package needs to be passed before or by the end of January 30th, or else we're heading for another partial government shutdown. But unfortunately, it's passed in the House, but now it's facing issues in the Senate because of the Department of Homeland Security component and the ongoing debates over immigration enforcement. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said that they are going to try to push through the other bills besides DHS, which in this case, TMF would be safe if they do that. There isn't much controversial about TMF. And so it should be safe if that plan sticks. However, given Congress, they're a little unpredictable when it comes to spending. So, I think they're very close in the clear, but it really depends on how the next few days play out.
Yeah, I was going to ask from your reporting, have you heard anything? I mean, I would imagine TMF is almost unanimously a positive bipartisan supported thing. Has there been anything that's in particular that's hung it up, or is it just politics at play?
It's I think a combination of things. It's procedural hurdles. So it needed to be reauthorized shortly after the government reopened from the longest shutdown. So that just kind of pushed a lot of what should have been routine bills and authorizations kind of to the wayside. And then, unfortunately, with the Senate, only one or two lawmakers can hold things up. So sources had told me last month that Senator Rand Paul was a big part of this, and he is chair of the committee that needs any sort of reauthorization to move forward. So that's why they often opt to throw these into spending packages where you're not going to have a lawmaker hold up the whole entire package just because of this one component. In 2017, when it was authorized, that's also it went into an NDAA. This isn't atypical. It's often you try to stick as much as you can in spending packages because normal everyday congressional hurdles are hard to deal with.
Sure. Well, we'll keep close watch and see if it does earn that reauthorization amid all the craziness of the spending bills and what's going on at DHS. Final thought, anything else you're keeping an eye on, Miranda?
Yeah, I think just as, we just hit the year mark with the Trump administration in its second term, and a large part of the first half of that year and still kind of lingering is the status of the federal workforce. And why that really plays a role with GSA is you saw, like every agency, you saw some of its workforce sort of either be laid off or involuntary resignations. And as a result, there's, a loss of expertise when it comes to government contracting. So something I've heard a lot at an event from GSA folks was we have this OneGov structure in place, for example, but we don't have enough contracting officers who are caught up on how to do this. So I think you can have a program in place, but the lack of workforce or the loss of workforce is something to keep an eye on to see if GSA and other agencies, of course, but in terms of contracting and procurement, if they do beef up those teams again, because I kind of got the sense when I was at an event with a lot of GSA people last month that the puzzle pieces are there, but you need somebody to put them together. So just something to keep an eye on. It'd probably be a while before we get actual workforce numbers for this coming year, but definitely something to keep in mind whenever talking about this.
I agree. I think that's going to be such an essential point of every story we're telling this year is, are they going to bring some of that workforce back to support these existing missions that can't be done without the talented, skilled employees? Miranda, fantastic conversation. Thanks for keeping us abreast of everything going on at GSA and, of course, everything else you do. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
For more news at the intersection of the federal government and technology, make sure to visit FedScoop.com. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Daily Scoop podcast, available on all podcast platforms. If you've already rated the podcast on your platform of choice, thanks so much. High ratings and good reviews of the show help more people to find it. The Daily Scoop podcast is a production of the Scoop News Group in Washington, D.C. Adam Butler and Carlin Fisher help put the show together, and the entire Scoop News Group team contributes. We'll be back tomorrow with more top headlines. Until then, I'm your host, as always, Billy Mitchell. Thanks so much for listening.